Why do we find ourselves secretly rooting for the villain? Why, in a story filled with heroes, do our eyes linger on the character cloaked in shadows, scheming, plotting, and often doing terrible things? Why do we cheer, even quietly, when they win a small victory, deliver a clever line, or reveal a tragic backstory that suddenly makes us feel empathy? It's one of the most fascinating paradoxes in human psychology, the allure of the villain. And today, we're going to dive deeply into the psychology of villains, exploring why they captivate us, why we empathize with them, and why we sometimes secretly hope they come out on top. From literature and mythology to comic books, television, and film, villains have always been with us. They are the dark counterpoint to the hero, the obstacle to overcome, the embodiment of chaos, greed, ambition, or revenge. Without them, stories would lack conflict and drama. But villains are not just plot devices, they are mirrors of our own psyche. When we look at them, we often see a distorted reflection of our own fears, desires, and frustrations. And this reflection can be strangely seductive. Let's start with the basics. A villain, at least in the traditional sense, is a character who opposes the hero. They create obstacles, they do harm, they pursue goals that threaten the world of the story. They are often portrayed as cruel, immoral, or destructive. Yet despite all this, they fascinate us. Why? One reason lies in the concept of shadow psychology, a term popularized by Carl Jung. Jung believed that within every human being there exists a shadow self, the part of us that holds impulses, desires, and traits we don't openly acknowledge. This shadow is made of everything we repress: anger, envy, lust, selfishness, aggression. Villains often embody these traits. They act out the parts of human nature we prefer to keep hidden. Watching them gives us a safe outlet for exploring our shadow selves. In rooting for the villain, we are not endorsing evil. We are acknowledging the suppressed parts of ourselves. Think about it. When a villain delivers a fiery monologue about breaking free from society's rules, aren't they giving voice to something many of us have felt at some point? That frustration with conformity, that desire to rebel, that fantasy of throwing off expectations and doing what we want without consequences. Heroes may inspire us with their morality and perseverance, but villains tempt us with freedom. They live without chains. They embrace what we suppress. And that is thrilling. Another psychological factor is the charisma of villains. Many of the most popular villains in fiction are not just evil. They are charming, witty, and magnetic. They have presence. They know how to command attention, how to make the audience lean in when they speak. Charisma is a powerful psychological weapon. It can make us overlook flaws, justify bad behavior, and even feel admiration for people we know are destructive. History itself is filled with charismatic figures who led people down dark paths. Fictional villains echo this same dynamic, seducing not only other characters but also us, the viewers. Villains also provide us with complexity, something we crave in storytelling. A flawless hero can feel boring, predictable, even shallow. But a villain who wrestles with their own pain, who carries trauma or a twisted sense of justice, feels human. We may not approve of their actions, but we understand them. Understanding breeds empathy, and empathy opens the door to rooting for someone. When a villain's motivations are rooted in loss, betrayal, or injustice, we can't help but sympathize. They become tragic figures, and humans are naturally drawn to tragedy. This is where the idea of the sympathetic villain comes into play. These are characters who commit terrible acts, yet their reasoning is understandable, even relatable. A villain who lost everything and seeks revenge may be cruel, but we can connect with their grief. A villain who wants to change a corrupt system by any means necessary may be ruthless, but we see echoes of our own frustration with injustice. When a villain's cause resonates with our own values, we may secretly want them to succeed, even if their methods are wrong. There's also the thrill of transgression. Villains break rules. They defy authority, challenge norms, and embrace the forbidden. Humans are wired with curiosity about the forbidden. We wonder what it would be like to steal, to cheat, to dominate, to lie without fear. Of course, most of us would never act on these impulses, but villains act them out for us. They become avatars for our curiosity. In cheering for them, we indulge in rebellion without consequence. It's a psychological safety valve for our darker impulses. We also root for villains because they often represent power. In many stories, the villain is the one with control, resources, and confidence. Heroes, by contrast, often struggle and suffer. Watching the powerful succeed, even when they're the antagonist, satisfies our desire to imagine ourselves in positions of control. It's no secret that humans are drawn to power. Power means freedom, safety, influence. Villains embody these things, and in rooting for them, we project our own yearning for strength. Another layer is the anti-hero phenomenon. Sometimes the line between hero and villain blurs. Characters like Walter White in Breaking Bad or Tony Soprano in The Sopranos commit villainous acts, but they're positioned as protagonists. We see their lives in detail, understand their motivations, and experience their struggles. This intimacy draws us to them. Even when they cross moral lines, we stay loyal because we've been brought into their perspective. Traditional villains, when given similar depth, inspire the same loyalty. But rooting for villains doesn't always require sympathy. Sometimes it's about entertainment value. Villains often get the best lines, the most dramatic entrances, the most memorable costumes. They are designed to dazzle. Theatrical villains, from Shakespeare's Richard III to modern comic book antagonists, steal scenes with their flamboyance. Audiences root for them not because they agree with their actions, but because they make the story exciting. Heroes may win in the end, but villains often make the journey worth watching. Psychologically, there's also the thrill of uncertainty. Heroes tend to follow moral codes. We know, broadly, how they'll act. Villains, on the other hand, are unpredictable. They might betray an ally, spare an enemy, or shift their goals entirely. This unpredictability keeps us on edge, and humans are drawn to suspense. We want to see what the villain will do next. In that anticipation, we find ourselves invested in their success, if only to keep the story unpredictable. Let's not forget catharsis. Watching villains act out aggression, anger, and vengeance can feel cathartic. They say and do things we wish we could in moments of rage. They take revenge against bullies, tyrants, or hypocrites, and in doing so, they provide us with a sense of justice, even if it's twisted. Rooting for them is sometimes less about their morality and more about the satisfaction of seeing someone unleash raw emotion. Now, let's go deeper into the psychological theories that explain this phenomenon. One is the concept of moral disengagement, introduced by psychologist Albert Bandura. Moral disengagement describes how people justify or overlook harmful behavior when it aligns with certain narratives. For example, if a villain's actions are framed as retaliation against a corrupt system, we may disengage from condemning them. We focus on their cause rather than their cruelty. This allows us to root for them without feeling guilty. Another relevant theory is identification. When we identify with a character, seeing ourselves in them, we experience their journey as our own. Heroes often represent ideals we aspire to. Villains, however, represent frustrations we actually feel. Identification with villains is powerful because it connects with real emotions: anger at injustice, resentment of authority, or fear of weakness. Identification turns spectators into silent supporters. Then there's the concept of schadenfreude, the pleasure we feel at others' misfortune. Villains often bring chaos to arrogant heroes, corrupt leaders, or hypocritical societies. When they succeed in humbling those figures, we feel satisfaction. It's not that we love the villain's cruelty. We love seeing pride punished. In these moments, villains act as agents of cosmic irony, and we root for them to restore a kind of dark balance. Another fascinating angle is the cultural role of villains. Different societies have different archetypes of villainy, shaped by their values and fears. In some cultures, villains represent greed and selfishness. In others, they symbolize rebellion against tradition. Rooting for villains can reflect cultural tensions. For example, in modern Western stories, villains often represent unchecked ambition or lust for power, reflecting fears of corruption. When audiences cheer for these villains, it may signal ambivalence about authority itself. The media we consume also plays a role. Over time, stories have evolved to make villains more complex, even sympathetic. In classic fairy tales, villains were one-dimensional: the wicked witch, the evil stepmother, the greedy king. But modern storytelling craves nuance. Today's villains are layered, tragic, and often relatable. Writers deliberately craft them this way because audiences respond to it. The more shades of grey a villain has, the more likely we are to root for them. Consider how often villains are given backstories that highlight trauma. Maybe they were betrayed, abandoned, or oppressed. These backstories don't excuse their actions, but they humanize them. And when we see humanity, we connect. It's no longer good versus evil. It's pain versus pain. In that space, rooting for the villain feels less like endorsing cruelty and more like honoring their humanity. There's also an evolutionary perspective. Humans are wired to pay attention to threats. Villains, by definition, are threatening. Our brains light up when we see danger, conflict, or deception. Rooting for villains may partly be an evolutionary byproduct. By paying close attention to threats, we increase our chances of survival. In fiction, this translates to fascination. The villain becomes the character we can't stop watching, even when we know they're destructive. Another layer is the archetype of the trickster, present in myths around the world. Trickster figures, like Loki in Norse mythology or Anansi in African folklore, often defy rules, break norms, and challenge authority. They are not purely evil, but they disrupt order. Audiences often love tricksters because they embody mischief, cleverness, and the joy of rebellion. Many modern villains inherit this trickster energy. They may be cruel, but they're also clever, and we can't help but admire cleverness. Rooting for villains also touches on our fascination with transformation. Heroes often maintain their integrity, but villains frequently change. They fall from grace, rise to power, or transform into monsters. Transformation is dramatic and compelling. We watch villains not just for what they do, but for what they become. Their journeys are often more dynamic than the heroes, and we root for them because they take us on wild, unpredictable rides. Finally, we root for villains because they make us feel anger, fear, pity, excitement. Villains stir strong emotions. Humans crave emotional intensity. In a world where daily life can feel routine, villains jolt us awake. They give us someone to love, hate, admire, and fear all at once. In that mix of emotions, rooting for them becomes almost inevitable. So why do we secretly root for villains? Because they are mirrors of our shadow selves. Because they charm us with charisma. Because they embody rebellion, power, and complexity. Because they humanize pain. Because they entertain, surprise, and excite. Because they give us catharsis, empathy, and identification. Because they are, in many ways, more like us than the heroes are. At the end of the day, rooting for villains is not about endorsing evil. It's about engaging with the full spectrum of human nature. Villains remind us that morality is complex, that darkness lives alongside light, and that even the most twisted characters can carry pieces of truth. When we cheer for them, secretly or openly, we are acknowledging that truth. And maybe, just maybe, we are learning to accept the parts of ourselves we usually keep hidden.